Hey, I'm Chloe Astor. You may know me from Proggies.
Alright, I'm gonna special this. I will go battle phase, I will declare an attack, and I will banish your face down on attack declaration.
My Final Fantasy XIV streams, or from Twitter, where I occasionally post ban lists, some of which have, blown up across Yu-Gi-Oh! Twitter. Now, in most of these lists, there's one card above all that I wish with a fervent passion would be banned. And as you probably guessed from the title, that's Called by the Grave. In fact, the reason I'm making this video in the first place is because every time I get a response to a list asking why Called by is banned, my sleeper cells activate and I become the Joker. Called by the Grave, if you aren't familiar, is a currently limited quick play spell that reads, target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, banish it, and if you do, until the end of the next turn, its effects are negated, as well as the activated effects and effects on field of monsters with the same original name. Now, I don't think Called by the Grave is on the same scale as some other cards on the Forbidden Limited list, like Topologic Gunblar Dragon, or like Graceful Charity, in terms of how egregiously it impacts the game. But it is an extremely unhealthy card to exist for a great many reasons, of which I will cover over the course of this video. Before I get into that though, it's important to discuss the concept of interaction in card games as a whole. I'll start the discussion with Hearthstone, which is a relatively low interaction CCG. Now, when I say low interaction, I don't mean that it's two simultaneous games of solitaire, as there's plenty of interplay in Hearthstone. And there is a difference. Interaction, as I will refer to it throughout the rest of this video, is the ability to actively impact or interrupt your opponent's plays. Interplay, on the other hand, is about your ability as a player to affect the outcome of the game. Hearthstone is a game where one player takes their turn, they play their cards, and then their opponent takes their turn and then plays their cards. There's a mechanic called Secrets, which allows you to play a spell that automatically triggers on your opponent's turn when they meet a condition, i.e. Objection, triggering when your opponent plays their first minion in a turn, or Counterspell doing the same for spells. There's reactive spells, like Frostbolt or Shadow Word Death, and more proactive abilities, like Loatheb or Blademaster Okani, that allow the player to directly impact their opponent without making gameplay decisions on their turn, and it's the opponent's onus to play through these effects. The important takeaway from this is, while Hearthstone players are still impacting the game in a meaningful way, they aren't doing so actively. Yu-Gi-Oh!, on the other hand, is an extremely high interaction CCG. Every action your opponent takes prompts a window in which you get to respond, whether that be with a trap, quick play spell, or monster effect. In older Yu-Gi-Oh!, cards like the Solemn Brigade, Bottomless Trap Hole, Book of Moon filled this need for strong and generic pieces of interaction, and saw a smattering of play for many years. These powerful tools were included in almost every deck, and the game was slow enough that trap cards were functionally guaranteed to get value even when going second. However, around the middle of 2017, the release of Zodiacs and the TCG, players started to cut trap cards in favor of hand traps, like Max C, Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, only including trap cards that were engine requirements, such as Zodiac Combo, or insanely powerful blowout cards that would win the game on the spot, like Dimensional Barrier or Imperial Order. At this point in the game's history, we begin to see the game speed up dramatically, with the subsequent release of decks like Spiral, Trickstar, Pendulum Magicians, and more. The interaction curve of Yu-Gi-Oh! Follows this acceleration, and outside of exactly trap-based control strategies like Altergeist or Eldritch, decks stop playing generic trap cards entirely for hand-based interaction that can slow down or even stop your opponent's plays on their first turn. As such, the core gameplay loop of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been condensed into the time frame of about 1 to 3 turns. The first turn is dedicated to player 1 setting up a board through any hand traps player 2 may have. The second is dedicated for player 2 to attempt to break that board and build their own, or kill player 1. If they fail to do either of these, the game usually ends on the next turn, because the third turn is then used for player 1 to either break and rebuild again, or to kill player 2. For this section, I'd like to immediately start talking about Called by the Grave, but when analyzing a card's design, it's really important to understand it contextually. Called by the Grave was printed in Flames of Destruction, which is a set that represented a massive shift in card design in Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards in this set were specifically designed in a way that would allow players to have answers to everything, most notably the introduction of Nightmares, Red Reboot, Infinite Impermanence, and of course, the aforementioned Called by the Grave. These cards represented a suite of generics that would allow players to answer hand traps, back row, and boards alike. Looking at the format at the time, this makes a lot of sense. In the OCG, which is where these cards were printed first, they were just coming out of a Tier 0 Spiral format, which is a deck that lacks once per turn clauses and has insanely powerful graveyard effects. The only other decks that could hope to keep up during this format were Burning Abyss and Infernoid, which were both extremely graveyard-reliant strategies, and Zefra, which was a pendulum-focused board-building deck with a smaller engine, allowing it to play upwards of 10 hand traps. Also important to this format contextually is not just the decks, but also the individual cards. Cards like Firewall Dragon and Crystron Halqifibrax, printed 3 years before its release in the TCG, being used en masse, means that a card the entire OCG format is balanced around, Maxi, was extremely game determinative, and the only answer to it at the time was 3 copies of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. At this point, the context for Called by the Grave's printing becomes a bit clearer. Coming out of a format where people were special summoning dozens of times in a turn, with Maxi beginning to become an extremely game-warping card, alongside multiple graveyard decks and decks playing a high count of powerful hand traps that still see play to this day, the idea of printing cards that address those issues makes sense. However, one of the major flaws with the design of Called by the Grave is that it was only a band-aid solution to all of these issues. I will refer to this type of card design from here onward as stopgap card design, meaning it is a card or cards designed to deal with a temporary issue in the format that ends up being a much larger design issue later down the line. A good secondary example of this concept is the introduction of the Bystial monsters as a way to address the Tier 0 TR limit format at the time. They intended to manage the deck's unmatched power and consistency, but they actually saw much play in Tier limit, allowing them to make Beatrice Lady of the Eternal relatively easily, which actually helped them play through the interaction the Bystials were intended to provide. In addition, Bystials almost single-handedly removed other darker light decks, like Mathmech and Drytron, not only from the format, but also from future formats. Magical Midbreaker Field is another example of this.
It's a field spell that prevents you from activating or setting other field spells. More importantly though, it prevents monsters on the field from being targeted or destroyed by their opponent's card effects during their main phase 1.
It was released in the OCG in early 2016, after the release of both Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit and Effect Veiler. This card served as a way to address hand traps, which at the time were extremely strong and seeing play in every meta deck, including Monarch, which historically is a bricky deck. Despite this, Midbreaker didn't see a huge amount of play. In the TCG, it had a similar impact on the game, until the release of Flames of Destruction, which introduced Goki Firewall format. In this deck, Midbreaker had a hand in creating one of the most toxic formats the game has ever seen, especially in conjunction with Called by the Grave, with the deck primarily aiming to either extra link or hand rip, while still setting up multiple interactions. These two cards ended up completely over-centralizing one of the least interactive combo decks in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Tangentially related to the idea of stopgap cards, I'd like to address the minigame. Anyone who plays Master Duel is likely familiar with this minigame, which begins when Maxi is activated, and plays out to determine if the Maxi resolves or not. As I mentioned earlier, Maxi was a format-warping card, but it actually still remains legal in both the OCG and Master Duel,
with around a 95% presence at the time of writing this.
This creates a sort of sub-game inside the main game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where people are forced to commit almost a quarter of their deck to cards that address Maxi. For example, say player A activates Maxi, then player B uses Ash Blossom to attempt to negate it. Unfortunately, player A has a set copy of Called by the Grave to negate the Ash Blossom, thereby winning the exchange. Player A is now in an immediately demanding position where the opponent must pass their turn, or risk drawing their opponent into a very large number of cards, which could include more points of interaction. To a lesser extent, this hand trap minigame is still present in the TCG with cards like Dimension Shifter and Drone Lockbird with Called by the Grave. Decks like Kashtira in 2023 ran Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, which worked double duty to both hit decks like Labyrinth and Branded, but with the added benefit of being able to negate Called by the Grave, ensuring their Dimension Shifter resolves if they were going second. The biggest issue with the minigame in any form, besides being infuriating, is that it provides zero level of skill expression and forces deck building decisions onto the player that reflect a severe game design imbalance, with over-centralizing individual cards like Maxi in the OCG, or Dimension Shifter in the TCG, requiring main deck answers that a strategy otherwise would not be playing. In reality, however, Called by the Grave doesn't actually effectively check these toxic lingering effects, because you won't always see it. This is especially true in the formats like the TCG where it's limited. Discussing it in that way sounds obvious. If you don't see a card, it obviously doesn't do anything. However, when you're discussing the justification for game-ending cards like Shifter to exist, it's unrealistic to use Called by the Grave as a stopgap to address these problems because you will see it so inconsistently, and when you do see it, it almost immediately decides the game. As such, it ends up being in a position where being at 1 makes the card both sacky and unreliable, but being at 2 or 3 makes the card much too powerful and consistent. On that topic, I'd like to address what Called by the Grave as an individual card is capable of. First, the primary function of Called by the Grave. It's able to negate hand traps. On your turn, it trades with 1 hand trap from your opponent's hand, excluding Nibiru the Primal Being and Infinite Impermanence, which you can't stop. In which case, if it's their only hand trap, it opens up the rest of your turn for you to combo at will. If they have more, it's still trading a card in hand to massively decrease your opponent's ability to interact, as the difference between having 1 and 2 hand traps is extremely large in the modern game. If they don't have any, because it's a quick play spell, you can set Called by the Grave and use it as an interaction on your opponent's turn, which is where the importance of how flexible this card is becomes clear. Important to note, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a general lack of good options for generic graveyard removal. A card like DD Crow, which simply reads Quick Effect, discard this card to the graveyard, then target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard, banish that target, has been extremely relevant since 2007, for almost 17 years. Called by the Grave being able to, at minimum, represent a similar level of interaction makes it an extremely valuable card to set. In fact, it can also function as a board breaker, as we're seeing in the current TCG format, as being able to banish Promethean Princess Bestower of Flames, or Sacred Fire King Garunix, from the graveyard removes multiple interactions from a Snake Eye player's end board, making it much easier to play through. It can also function as a sort of pseudo-engine card in decks like Exosister, which can use it to manually trigger Exosister Martha on the opponent's turn. However, the most egregious strength this card has is that it's an insanely good top deck in a grind game. Most cards that address hand traps, for example Crossout Designator, Sideframe Gear Gamma, etc., tend to be almost completely dead when you draw them in a grind game, generally getting little to no value once the game state is simplified. However, Called by the Grave has the ability to negate any card it banishes in grave, meaning that you can banish an engine piece your opponent has already gone through on their previous turn to negate the effects of one your opponent has on field, making it not only a great card on the play, but also on the draw. In addition, hitting quick effect engine cards like Labyrinth Chandragleer or Alubra the Jester of Despia works double duty, because it negates for 2 turns, so you're not only negating the first one and removing it from the graveyard, but also preventing them from activating a second one they may have on the next turn. Cards that counter hand traps have proven themselves to be invaluable in a modern context, so I'd like to go more in depth on one of the main strengths of Called by the Grave that I didn't cover in the previous section, which is that Called by the Grave, unlike its contemporaries, has functionally no deck building cost. Every other card that has the ability to stop hand traps has some form of drawback or limitation, but Called by the Grave lacks any such restrictions. The first of a few examples, the previously mentioned Magical Midbreaker field, was undoubtedly strong. However, it has 2 key restrictions. The first is that you cannot play in any deck that requires a field spell, as it prevents you from activating them entirely. The second is that it's double-sided, so if you decide to play hand traps like Effect Veiler or Ghost Ogre, they are turned off by your own protection effect. Sideframe Gear Gamma requires playing an unsummonable vanilla monster to address hand traps, it's completely dead in the grind game due to its restriction of controlling no monsters, and it was still powerful enough to be limited. There's also the Millenniumize Restrict and Instant Fusion package, which has the very significant deck building cost of not only the main deck slots for Instant Fusion, but also an extra deck slot. This combo saw heavy use in Spiral and Magical Musketeer due to its flexibility as both a board breaker and play insulator, and was also common in decks that wanted to play Instant Fusion as an extender, for example 2019 Thunder Dragon with Kaminari Attack. Also, due to Master Rule of 4's summoning restrictions at the time, it actually required 2 extra deck slots. You needed access to a copy of Linkuriboh, now banned, to retain a link arrow, meaning you could only installate your plays before using the extra deck. Despite these drawbacks, Instant Fusion was strong enough to be limited on the April 2020 Forbidden and Limited list. Finally, I'd like to discuss the closest comparison to Called by the Grave, Crossout Designator. In the deck building process, they fulfill very similar roles, which is primarily to stop hand traps. However, that's where the comparison ends, because for Crossout Designator, you need to be playing every card you want to stop.
This means that for every generic card you care about in a format, you must play at least one copy of it in order for Crossout to gain value.
This also has another caveat, which is that if you draw the card you want to stop, and you're only playing one of it, Crossout can no longer stop that card, meaning that in order to guarantee that Crossout will resolve when you need it, you're incentivized to include more copies of said cards in your deck. While Crossout can also be a frustrating card that creates non-games in a similar way, its design is much more healthy than Called by the Grave, due both to the higher deck building cost and weaker effect. Called by the Grave, on the other hand, does not require you to supplement it with any type of deck or play any other cards in your deck for it to function, as it is entirely self-contained. The only significant drawback this card has is that it can turn off your own copies of hand traps like Ash Blossom if you negate one, and happen to have another in hand. In exchange for this drawback, however, the board you're able to present becomes much more powerful than you would have been able to make otherwise, which heavily mitigates this loss. Hopefully I was able to convey why I believe Called by the Grave is not only a ban-worthy card, but a massive design oversight. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta has developed to a point where the best decks in the format require the opponent to draw multiple hand traps to interact effectively on their first turn. Otherwise, the likelihood of breaking their board on your turn drops significantly. Opening Called by the Grave going first in a deck like that almost single-handedly decides the game by itself, removing a huge amount of player agency in that game. Even if the going second player doesn't open any hand traps, Called by the Grave will still generate an insane amount of value as an interruption on their turn, as the evolution of Yu-Gi-Oh! To a game where the graveyard is commonly referred to as a second hand means a card like Called by the Grave provides too much power and flexibility to healthily exist. It is a card that has always existed in the modern metagame since its inception, and even in formats where there are many answers to it, i.e. in a Shizu tier format using shufflers or Bystials to bypass the negation, or formats where Kashtira or Riseheart banishes everything, it is always a card worth considering for the main or side deck. Relying on drawing a non-searchable card, especially a limited one, to answer a turn-ending threat like Dimension Shifter or Droll and Lockbird, is not only bad game design, but it's not sufficient justification for those cards' continued existence, and the just draw the out mentality in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an extremely poor reason to justify cards like Called by the Grave existing. Thank you all for watching. I'd like to give some huge shoutouts to Dymax, iWish TCG, and Kieran Dalchikage for helping me out with early stages of this project. And a special shoutout to Awesome Sauce on Discord for assisting me with the Hearthstone section. Also huge shoutouts to Emperor Stove for editing this for me, as I have never touched editing software a day in my life. You can follow me on Twitter at DoXIV, and subscribe to my YouTube if you want to see the best progression series on the market, and sometimes Final Fantasy XIV clears. If you want to see more content like this, I can't guarantee it because I have ADHD and need intense motivation to do anything of this scale. However, I still appreciate any comments and subscribers to boost the algorithm. Thanks again for watching, have a great day.